Bueno, bienvenidos a esta segunda fecha de estas actividades que estamos teniendo en la Universidad Católica con el profesor Robin Dunbar, organizadas por el Grupo Interdisciplinario de Investigación, Mente y Lenguaje y el Estudios Generales de Letras de la Universidad. Seguramente muchos de ustedes han tenido la oportunidad de escuchar ayer al profesor Dunbar, pero quienes lo vean por primera vez, es bueno que sepan que el profesor Dunbar se graduó como bachiller en Psicología y Filosofía de la Universidad de Oxford y obtuvo un PhD en Psicología por la Universidad de Bristol. Ha sido director del programa de becas de investigación de Cambridge y ha enseñado en diferentes universidades, como la Universidad de Suecia, la University College de Londres y la Universidad de Liverpool. Actualmente, el profesor Dumbar es profesor de Antropología Evolutiva y director del Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology en la Escuela de Antropología de la Universidad de Oxford. Es el codirector del Proyecto Centenario de Investigación de la Academia Británica, Losing to Language, the Archeology of Social Brain, un proyecto interdisciplinario que reúne a varias universidades del Reino Unido. Es autor, coeditor y editor de más de una docena de libros, entre los que se incluyen Primate Social Systems, The Trouble with Science, Grooming, Gossip and the Evolution of Language, The Evolution of Culture, and Interdisciplinary View, Cousins or Primate Relatives, y Human Evolutionary Psychology, The Human Story, entre otros y numerosos artículos científicos. El profesor Dunbar hoy día nos va a hablar de un tema que nos interesa a muchos, que es acerca de la evolución del lenguaje. Hemos tenido la oportunidad de tener en la universidad hace 2 años a otro importante especialista en este campo, que fue el profesor Derek Bickerton, también presentándonos sus tesis sobre la evolución del lenguaje, y hoy día vamos a escuchar una perspectiva diferente. El texto es Why Only Humans Have Language, ¿por qué solo los humanos tienen lenguaje? La conferencia va a ser en inglés. Ustedes han recibido un resumen en español de la conferencia y van a poder seguir también con el PowerPoint. Entonces, luego de que el profesor Dunbar haga su conferencia, nosotros iniciaremos una discusión con el público también. Bien, dejo la palabra al profesor Dunbar.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I thought it would be quite good in this context, having talked about the evolution of sort of sociality, I suppose, and social relationships yesterday, to look in more detail at the evolution of language, because clearly language has become a central plank in human sociality and, of course, human culture. Without language, we can't have culture, and therefore, in the end, we can't have science either. Never mind philosophy. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to really look at these 3 issues. The first one, mention of Derek Bickerton reminds me that when I first came up with the suggestion that language was, the origins of language was social, it was about social information, and I wrote the book Grooming, Gossip and the Evolution of Language. Derek Bickerton in particular, when he reviewed the book, said, how is it possible to write a book on language without even mentioning grammar at all, not even as a footnote? And this is true because at no point really in any of my writings on the evolution of language have I ever said anything about grammar. I take grammar for granted as the mechanism through which allows us to express complex thoughts, if you like, in language, but instead ask the question, what kinds of information is language, and therefore grammar, allowing us to do, which is not possible for, let's say, monkeys and apes or any other species to exchange amongst themselves because they don't have language. And in this sense, I'm seeing language and grammar as one and the same thing, that language as we have it is dependent on grammar. It's central to it. So I'm not asking questions about the origins of grammar, the evolution of grammar, but really asking questions about why this grammatical structured communication system that we have exists at all. And it seems to me there have been, in general, only two kinds of explanations. This kind of factual, instrumental information explanations, the class of these, are the ones that everybody has assumed to be the case. Right? All the people who've ever worked on language, the linguists, the psychologists, the archaeologists, anthropologists, they all assume that the reason language exists is to allow us to exchange information about factual matters. Okay, this is how you make a tool. This is how you perform, let's say, a dance or some ritual. This is, an instructional purpose that language has, to tell you how to do things, or to provide information about things in the world that may be important. So you come back as a hunter-gatherer to your camp in the evening and you say, today I saw some bison down by such and such a lake. Tomorrow let's go and hunt them. And so you make plans about how to hunt, where to go, how to coordinate the hunting group to go and do these things. Or, if you like, once agriculture came about, this is how you plant your plants and what you have to do to make them grow successfully. And that view, I think, dominated our whole understanding and approach to language just implicitly. It was never really thought about, and it was never really, I don't think, discussed in great detail. It was just assumed that that's what language existed for. And it seemed to me, coming from studying social systems, really, in primates and other mammals, and starting to look at humans, that there was an issue in which language performed a very important function in this context, and that's really that it had a social function. It was the exchange of information about what's going on within the society, within the social network, the exchange of gossip, if you like, about what other people are doing that might explain why language evolved. And so in effect at this point, what you have is two alternative theories or general theories of why language evolved, both of which you can provide evidence for. Right? You can argue that, yes, we do use, you can show we use language for instrumental instruction. That's what happens in universities. That's what happens in school. The professor teaches the students facts about the world in some sense. So it's clear that we do that, but it's equally clear that outside the classroom, we spend a lot of our time discussing, who is doing what with who, and who has behaved badly, and who has behaved very nobly, and all these kind of things. So it's clear that both of these uses for language are in some sense true. The question from an evolutionary point of view is one a cause, as it were, of language evolution, and the other a consequence of language evolution? Or are both of them equal selection factors that have driven language evolution, caused language? This distinction between cause and consequence is very important in biology. Evolutionary biologists in general are very suspicious of attempts to have multiple causes, multiple selection factors driving the evolution of anything. They much prefer to have a single, if you like, prime mover, in a sort of semi-philosophical sense, that is responsible for pushing the evolution of a character or a trait, and then it's possible to have lots of other components, selection factors, which are secondary. That's fine. But the key thing in evolutionary terms is having what are called windows of opportunity. So evolutionary processes in the real world are very often characterized by these windows of opportunity, and particularly in that context, sexual selection is a very important motor. So what happens is a trait evolves because it has a functional value, there's selection for it in some respect, but then sexual selection kicks in. Once you've got that trait, sexual selection kicks in and exploits it for a completely different purpose, usually to do with mate selection, of course, and those aspects of fitness, as opposed to the kind of survival and eating and avoiding predators aspects of fitness. So, for example, you might think of our bipedalism. Our bipedalism evolved to allow us to travel long distances very efficiently in the savannas of Africa in particular, and also to kind of avoid predators by being able to run quite fast, and so on. So the trait originally evolved to support life survival traits, as most things do, but then what's happened is sexual selection comes along, and because the girls like very athletic young men, usually, we can take a vote on this. So pressure mate choice from, if you like, the women selects further for very efficient athletic skills in males on top of the usual original purposes for which bipedalism and fast movement occurs. So there's kind of selection for sportsmen, if you like, who excel at these kind of things. That's sexual selection at work, exploiting windows of opportunity, exploiting the capacity that evolution has produced for another purpose. And that's a kind of consequence of these kind of evolutionary processes. So here, avoiding predators or foraging more efficiently over very big areas is the cause of, evolutionary cause of bipedalism, but then sexual selection kicks in and adds to that as a sort of consequence effect. So the question we can ask about these two different kinds of function for language is, did language originally evolve for this purpose, but then we adapted it for social purposes? Or did it maybe evolve for social purposes, and then, because of the capacity it provides, get adapted for kind of instrumental factual information exchange? And the analogy I always use here is the evolution of the computer. Right? Now, most of you have grown up in the computer generation, as they say, the digital age. You have to remember that some of us, very old people, were alive before the dinosaurs went extinct. Right? We wrote our PhDs with things called pens. Right? And even before us, there was a generation who used feathers from chickens, quill pens. This has happened very, very fast. But if you look at the history of computers, you kind of get a sense of how this cause and consequence argument applies constantly. So remember, computers were evolved originally as pure counting machines to do arithmetic. So Babbage's computational engines, the original Victorian computer from the 19th century, just added up and subtracted, and that's about it. All right? So when I did my PhD in the early 1970s, I was very privileged to have an extremely expensive calculator, which I bought myself, which could add up, subtract, multiply, and divide. And that's all it could do. Right? And this, I mean, it's astonishing. That cost me £30 UK pounds in 1971, and that's all it could do. That's equivalent to probably £1,000 now. And when you think you can buy a calculator that can do that and do some programming now for, you know, sort of 15 or 20 US dollars, let's say, it's just extraordinary. But if you look at what's happened to the computer in that time, you can see these kind of evolutionary windows of opportunity very nicely, because what's happened? is that the same technology, the same software capacity, computational capacity, has been adapted to provide us with machines that can paint cars and assemble cars and do all those kind of things, to take off and land aeroplanes without pilots even, fly spaceships to the moon, all these kind of things. It's been adapted on the other side to do accounting for businesses, so you can keep records of your the number of goods you've sold and whether you need now to buy some more from your supplier, all these things. And of course, most importantly for us, it's been developed into the capacity for word processing, allowing us to write beautiful essays and beautiful term papers and wonderful PhD theses, because even it checks your grammar and it checks your spelling and all these things. But it's the same basic software technology of just counting, essentially, that's allowing it to do that. So all these other uses that have come along are acting just like sexual selection and other evolutionary processes of these kind of consequential selection processes. And the test that evolutionary biologists use in this context to distinguish between these two kinds of selection factors is if you believe that instrumental or factual functions are what selected for the evolution of language, they're the primary evolutionary cause, could you remove that cause and then not have language? If you took all this away, would language cease to exist? Would the trait not be selected for anymore because its main function has been removed? And these secondary functions are not powerful enough to maintain that trait in the population over time, right? If that's the case, then that's the true primary cause of evolution. And the secondary cause that's much weaker in that sense is literally a consequential cause, a window of opportunity effect. So this distinction is important, and it also allows us, like a surgeon using a scalpel to make very fine cuts in the body when they're doing surgery, it allows us to ask more precise questions, if you like, and test better theories. So I'm going to try and convince you, if you're not already convinced, that really language evolved to bond social groups. That this instrumental or factual use of language is really secondary. And then, having done that, I'm at the end going to see whether we can answer the question of when did language evolve in the course of human history? Because obviously we come from primates which don't have language, that's our lineage. Our family are the great apes, we belong to the great ape family. And remember, in the last 20 years, the big surprise in evolutionary biology, particularly paleo and in anthropology, has been the realization, the discovery from the genetic evidence that rather than being a special case of the great apes, we are actually embedded right in the middle of the great ape family. So the assumption had been for hundreds of years in taxonomy that the great apes, the chimpanzees, the gorilla, and the orangutan from Southeast Asia form one family of great apes, and then humans and our ancestors, the Australopithecines and so on, form a separate family that broke away from the great apes maybe 20 million years ago. That was the anatomical evidence and the fossil evidence combined, because the ancestors, the orangutan, are at least 16 million years old. There are fossil orangutans of that age. And so if we all belong to a separate family, then we must have split off before the orangutan separated from the African great apes. But the genetic evidence shows this is not true, that actually we and the chimpanzees, the two species of chimpanzees, the bonobo and the chimpanzee itself, belong to the same small family group, and that we are the last separation, and that happened long after the separation of the gorilla from the ancestral African great apes, and a very long time after the separation of the orangutan from the ancestors of all the great apes together. And what really has been very surprising is the discovery that the gorilla, actually, although all gorillas look very, very similar, in fact, there are two species of gorilla, the West African gorilla and the East African gorilla, and these are genetically more different than we are from the chimpanzees. Yet we class them as belonging to the same species. Right, so our whole understanding of evolutionary history has been turned upside down by genetics in the last 20 years. Genetics is full of interesting surprises for us. Well, I'll just give you two ones that amuse me, but are quite famous now. One is that 1/12 of all the men in the world alive today are the descendants of Genghis Khan and his brothers. 1/12. And if you come from the original area of the Mongol Empire, stretching from China in the east right through to Hungary and Eastern Europe, it's much higher than that. It's about 1 in 7 males are the direct descendants, the lineal descendants of Genghis Khan and his brothers, genetically. He did very well. But if you think about how he did it, whenever he conquered a city and adults, and the women were taken as prizes of war, booty of war, by his army, and especially by the generals, that's him and his various brothers. And the other example is Iceland, a little island that sits between Canada and Northern Europe, which was settled by the Vikings from Scandinavia around 800 AD. At the time, very shortly afterwards, they actually made it all the way across to North America and settled in northeastern Canada, on the coast of Canada, long before Columbus got here. Scandinavians got here first from Europe. Actually, probably the US archaeologists now think that people arrived in North America from Europe as early as 16 to 20,000 years ago. It may actually have been among the first people to get here, even before the American Indian Eskimo influx across the Barrier Strait. But it turns out from the genetics, now Iceland's a very small country. It's been very isolated pretty much since the 10th century AD, had not much traffic. It turns out that all the men in Iceland have their Y chromosomes, which they inherit from their fathers and only from their fathers, are all good Norse Scandinavian Y chromosomes, something like 95% of them. But 80% of the women have their X chromosomes that are Celtic chromosomes. They're not Scandinavian at all. They're Celtic chromosomes from Ireland and from Scotland. So I think what happened was the reason the Vikings went to Iceland in particular very often was because they were expelled from their country. Right? The king of Norway or Denmark got fed up with these people being a nuisance and fighting all the time in town and said, "You're banished." And so they went off to Iceland and they settled there. And you can see what happened. The guys went home to the wife in Norway and said, "I'm sorry, dear, we've got to go to Iceland. I've been banished." And she said, "You have to be joking." I'm not coming there. It's, the secret is in the word ice at the beginning. It's not a good place to go. And so they kind of went, "Oh, well, okay, I've got to go. I've got no choice. If I don't go, I get killed. You know, I've got 24 hours to leave. Otherwise, I'm going to be executed. Never mind, I will go and collect a wife on the way." So they made a brief stop in Scotland or Ireland, picked up some girls who didn't have any choice, I have to say. But I'm sure all these Icelandic women, even though they're of Celtic origin, are very happy to be there now, whatever it is, 10 centuries later. So that's what happens in history. So genetics has really kind of told us a lot about history, as it were, that, as well as evolution, that we didn't know beforehand. Okay, so these are the 4 hypotheses that have been suggested for the evolution of language. Here's the original instrumental or factual information exchange one. And then since the 90s, there have been these 3 proposals for alternative social information exchange models, if you like. This is my original gossip theory. What language functions to do is to allow you to find out what's going on in your social world, to tell people what a wonderful person you are, what a wonderful romantic partner you would make, boasting, PR, public relations, all these kind of things. Then Jeff Miller came up with the idea that actually sexual selection, well, he picked up on this whole sexual selection argument and suggested that sexual selection had been a really important motor in the evolution of language and indeed the brain. And argued that, you know, we have language only because we have a big brain capable of doing the computations necessary to produce language, the thoughts, and to turn them into words and so on. And that what this was really driven by was not factual information exchange, not social gossip about your friends, but it was purely advertising in the context of mate selection. And he adduced various kinds of evidence to support that claim. For example, although women in general are better at language, more skilled at language, and develop language earlier as children, nonetheless, in almost all cultures, they have use a much more restricted vocabulary than men. Men's language tends to be more flowery, contain more big words, be more complex. And he argued that what men are doing is like a peacock, waving its tail in front of the girls and saying, look how good my genes are. My brain, they produce such good brain for me that I can produce these wonderfully poetic words and impress you with all this. And he argued that this is why novelists and poets predominantly tend to be male, and they tend to be most productive during the period of mate searching. Right, so during their 20s and 30s, when they're looking for partners, that's when most novelists and poets tend to produce their best work. And that after that, when they find a partner, they stop producing so much and get older quietly. Whereas women novelists tend to produce their peaks much later in life. And he said, okay, well, that's a consequence of having more free time later in life. But the contrast really is the fact that males are much more active in these kind of areas, including in music and so on, during that time of their life in their 20s and 30s when they're actively seeking mates. And then Terry Deaking, the neurobiologist, in his book, The Symbolic Species, argued that language evolved to allow us to make essentially symbolic contracts with each other. And the reason this is important is that one of the distinctive features of human sociality the world over is the division of labor, and therefore the tendency, combined with the monogamous mating system. So you have a monogamous pair-bonded mating system in which one man, one woman form a reproductive pair and produce offspring. And that's sort of typically the norm, even though polygamy occurs in some societies. Nonetheless, the foundation of this is really in some form of monogamous relationship. But that what happens every day in all societies is the two sexes go off and do different things. The division of labor in traditional hunter-gatherer societies, pre-agricultural societies, such as you might still see in Kung San hunter-gatherers in Botswana and South Africa, the so-called Bushmen, that you might still see in remnant American Indian populations that are still hunters and gatherers particularly in the Amazon basin, perhaps the forests. The men go off hunting, and they may be away for several days, and they leave their wives in the camp, and they may go collecting vegetables and so on, but still they're left in the camp where any males from another valley can come and mate with them, not necessarily attack them or anything and steal them, but they may come and mate with them because the women want to mate with lots of men. And when you come home, you discover a new baby, and it's not yours. And this is not a good thing, because all this hard work you're doing, hunting for peccaries or whatever it may be, to bring back to your lovely wife and your children, in fact, you're feeding another man's child. And from an evolutionary point of view, this is not a good thing, right? Because you're promoting somebody else's genes at your expense. So the other males are behaving like free riders on the system, exploiting the social contract, if you like. But also, you are being exploited, both by your lovely wife and by her lover. And therefore, what you need is some mechanism that prevents mate stealing in this form. And he argued that the symbolic revolution, and therefore our big brains, and therefore language, came about because of the need to have social signals that a couple, a male and a female, were bonded to each other, were married, if you like, and therefore you mustn't touch. And so, and you know, you can think of lots of evidence of that kind of arrangement. We have marriages, ceremonies, a big thing in church, and then afterwards you have feasts for days and days and days, and lots of dancing. And this is kind of publicly marking the fact that this couple here, this young couple, are now married. They are not to be interfered with. Old relationships have to be cast aside, and you must not try and steal this man's wife or steal that girl's husband. And then we use lots of other markers, wedding rings. In Tahiti, you have a flower, women typically have a flower behind the ear, and they move it from the right side to the left side, if that's the right way around, I can't remember now, depending on whether they're single or married, and that signals that you're not available anymore. And that these social mechanisms, these social symbols, are used to defend, if you like, the pair bond and make it more stable through time. I don't think he would be too worried about the fact that they don't always work, these signals. So long as they work, they reduce the risk enough that mate stealing is reduced, and therefore babies conceived by other fathers, as it were, don't happen all the time. You know, it's a question about how much you can tolerate. Evolutionary biology has suggested from mathematical analyses that although paternal certainty is a big problem for mammals, the problem for mammals is that the females, the women, know whose baby this is, right? They gave birth to it. There is no doubt where it came from. But the males, and in humans, the men, can never be 100% certain that this baby is theirs. And that's the root of the problem. What you're trying to do is kind of make it more certain that the baby is your baby. And we have lots of mechanisms for doing this. A very nice study that was done in Mexico about 15 years ago, but it's been replicated else. Actually, no, it was done in Canada by Martin Daly, and it's been replicated in Mexico since, showing that in a hospital, maternity hospital with newborn babies, if you listen to what, and this is absolutely spectacular, you can hear it just next time you go to somebody in your family has a baby, just listen, right, to the comments. That when the family come, the husband's parents and the wife's parents, when the husband comes, suddenly they start, the wife, the mother, and the mother's family all start to say, Oh, it has to the husband, the baby has your eyes, the baby has your nose, the baby has your chin. To say, this is your baby, you've got to, this is definitely your baby. So, you know, you can be bonded to the baby and change the nappies and do all this kind of thing without fear. And it's amazing. I mean, it's just like clockwork, this happens all the time. And the great irony is, all babies have the same colored eyes. Doesn't matter what race you come from, all babies have blue eyes. All babies look the same. They don't start to develop their adult characteristics and resemble their parents until they're quite old, at least 5 usually. So it looks like babies, and this is one theory that's been proposed by Mark Pagel, is babies have been designed by evolution to look like everybody in their own interest. It's a very bad idea to arrive in the world and show that you belong to somebody else or you were fathered by somebody else. This is not a good strategy. So all these kind of subtleties are at play. They're all part of this problem that Terry Deakin identified as the core to human language, really, and that from his point of view, from the language point of view, everything we do in language is built around this need to create evidence of pair bond protection, if you like, and then anything else beyond that, gossip, information exchange, is all secondary. So let's look at these a little more. I just remind you of this. This is the graph I showed you yesterday of the social brain hypothesis, social group size in primates. Each one of these is one, it's actually one genus of primates, one family of primates. These are monkeys, these are the apes. Plotted against neocortex ratio. These are, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the more complex issues lying behind that this afternoon in the second workshop, actually. I'm going to talk a bit more about the nature of bonding and pair bonding in particular. And these are some of the evidence that, again, I showed you yesterday, so I'm not going to go into great detail, that humans have this predicted group size of about 150. And we have evidence, both of this kind of ethnographic kind, from traditional, small-scale traditional societies, but also data from modern, if you like, Western post-industrial societies, showing that this figure of 150 really does have reality. And here, in essence, is the root of the problem that all, if you like, human societies face, but not just human societies, primate societies as a whole. And I mentioned yesterday in answer to one of the questions, the issue for primate societies is that they have these bonded social systems which are very different to those you find in most mammals and birds, most other mammals and birds, not all, but most, in the sense that you have very deep relationships of commitment to friends or mates, which are based on intense interactions and intense relationships with each other. And one suggestion is that this has evolved to counteract the key problem that primate societies face, including ours. And that key problem arises from the fact that sociality in this form is a social contract. It's an implicit social contract in the case of primates. In other words, they don't think about it in these terms, but that's how it works. That's how it can be described. In the case of humans, it's an explicit social contract, sometimes, not always, but sometimes we can say we will make an arrangement to protect ourselves by working together, or we will cooperate to solve this task, to build this, well, this great huaca or whatever it is that you happen to have in the archaeological record, as it were, at a particular time, this great temple or cathedral or something. We'll all work together and build it as a cooperative venture. But any time you have that kind of implicit or explicit social contract, you always run the risk that some people will agree to the social contract, but when it comes to the point of making their payment for it, will not do so. So these are people we call free riders. Right? There are people who take the benefit of the social contract but don't pay the cost, because what was required by a social contract is you accept that you must not take or be completely selfish. You must restrict your selfishness in order to allow everybody else in the group, the community, to have a fair share of the benefits of the contract and a fair share of the costs of the contract. And if you act as a free rider, then what you do is you take the benefits, but you impose the cost, your share of the costs, back onto everybody else, and they end up paying for it. All right? This is a very familiar problem for us. We face it all the time, on the small scale and on the big scale. On the small scale, everyday scale, we face it in terms of people who borrow things from us but never return them, where the implicit agreement is, I will lend you something now, but in next year, perhaps you'll help me out by lending me something else in return. We face it on the, I suppose, on the modern national scale. You know, we do things like painting yellow lines on the side of roads to say you must not park here, you must not stop here. And then we get very upset about it. We put 2 yellow lines to say you really must not park here, but people ignore it. And they park where they shouldn't park in order just to go to the shop very quickly to buy a newspaper or something, thinking, oh, it won't hurt. But remember, the reason we make these rules for example, how we use the road, is to allow communal advantages to happen. That communal advantage is usually to allow fire engines and ambulances and so on to have access to places so that if there's a fire, they can put them out. And if you park there, it may be that a fire comes and you're blocking the fire engine, for example. So all these things, we're constantly breaking these rules. It's got so bad in England that in London, we have 1 yellow line saying you mustn't park here, 2 yellow lines saying you definitely mustn't park here, and in the last few years there are now 2 red lines saying you definitely mustn't park here. But it still doesn't work. Free riding is all the time. And we see it on the grand scale in terms of the exploitation of tropical forests, the exploitation of oceanic resources, the oceanic fishing, right? Everybody knows that if we cut down all the trees in the Amazon, for example, we're all going to die. There aren't going to be enough trees to turn carbon back into oxygen to live by. So we would all benefit by having the Amazon forest stay there, by having the deep sea fisheries farmed sustainably, right? Not to take too many fish from the sea. But we all ignore it and rush around as fast as we can, cutting down the trees in the African and Asian and American forests, because there's money in it, short-term benefit to be gained, and we don't worry too much about the costs. And the same with the fisheries. The cod fisheries, the North Atlantic used to have enormously rich cod fishing grounds for, you know, giant-sized cod, both off the Canadian coast, right through across Iceland into northern European waters. And that fishing industry has collapsed about 50 years ago, particularly on the western side of the Atlantic. The herring fishing industry, the herring was hugely productive, produced lots and lots of these sort of so-sized fish, and that's collapsed because of overfishing. So we do it all the time. Whenever the payback comes in the future, we have this discounting of the future, and let them say, okay, let the younger generation worry about it, you know, as long as us oldies are doing well. So these are free rider effects, and they're really problematic for us. So we have to have a mechanism to control those. And this is just a little demonstration of this effect. It's actually a computer model by 2 Swedes, Scandinavians, who are theoretical biologists, in which they said, okay, well, let's imagine there's a world in the computer that consists of lots of individuals, and that these individuals have to cooperate to survive and reproduce, or to reproduce effectively. They have to exchange gifts with each other, resources, in order to to successfully reproduce. They have to make trading agreements. And into that population of cooperators, we'll just introduce one or two free riders who take the gifts given by one person, but don't pay them back later in an exchange relationship. And what they showed was that there were two critical things that affected your how well the population evolved, if you like. One was the search time required to find a new partner. How difficult it was to find new trading partners. And the other was what they call the coalition time, how much time you had to invest in creating a trading relationship before your partner would trade with you. So essentially you had to invest time and effort and perhaps resources in creating a trading relationship in the first place before that trading relationship would work. And they showed that free riders are successful in a very wide range of combinations of these two. In areas where coalition time is very short, in other words, you don't have to invest too much to create a trading relationship, and in areas where the search time is very low, in other words, it doesn't take you long to find a new population in the area who don't realize you're a free rider. If you get discovered by your trading partners that are free riding, you can quickly move to another part of the city and make new friends who don't yet realize that you're such a bad citizen. That in these kind of areas, free riders are extremely successful, and they very quickly wipe out cooperators. Cooperators are driven to extinction. And there's only a small corner up here, essentially, where free riding is not successful. In other words, areas where the search time is very high, population is very interconnected in particular. So this is a problem here, in effect, when you have large dispersed populations, like you have in hunter-gatherers, where the community is distributed over a very wide area. You can quickly go to another place and find some naive people who don't know about you. Or conversely, if you have to invest a lot of time and effort in making a relationship, then it makes it very difficult and costly for free riders to escape. So it's just up in this corner, really, that free riding is selected against. Everywhere else, it's very easy for free riding to occur, to be successful, and when they're successful, they drive cooperators completely to extinction. And the whole social contract collapses. So how, in this context, then, do you facilitate social cohesion in the community to allow the social contract to work so that each person in the community then gets the benefit from the social contract? In primates, this is done by essentially social grooming, this kind of stuff, in which individuals groom with each other, establish these very tight bonded relationships. And what you find is that as group size increases in these species, so each of these is one species, the average one species, so grooming time gets bigger, roughly on a linear relationship, but it's subject to this kind of asymptote at about 20% of daytime, purely as a result of time. In the real world, the animals need the rest of this time for finding food, basically, for moving from feeding site to feeding site and for actually extracting food from the environment. But within this restriction, the bigger your group, the more time you have to devote to social interaction. Interestingly, this doesn't necessarily mean you groom with more people. As you go up through here, what you find is they concentrate more and more of this grooming time on fewer and fewer individuals. And the reason seems to be to make sure that relationship really works, because this is, in effect, a defensive alliance. These grooming partners are coalitions in their own right to protect you from the stresses of living in the group. Because the problem with living in big groups is not only are the benefits, but you pay a cost for it as well. And that cost is the fact that you're all kind of cramped together and people are disturbing you all the time, and occasionally they're stealing stuff from you and so on. So you need these protective relationships to protect you against those. So what happens is they're trading off, trying to balance two different effects, to keep the whole group together, but also protect themselves from the stresses of the group. Okay, so if you plug humans into this with our group size of 150, you would predict from the basic primate relationship that we would have to spend about 45% of our total day engaged in grooming. If we were to groom our big communities by the same mechanisms that, if we were to bond our big communities by the same mechanisms that primates do. And I can tell you, I've already showed you the data yesterday, I'll mention it again in a minute, but because of the fact that grooming, and we still do it, and we still do grooming, we call it cuddling and petting and stroking. It's exactly the same as what primates do, in effect. It produces this endorphin surge. So you would be on the biggest opiate high you had ever had if you spent that amount of time cuddling somebody. Ready? This would be even better than in the 1960s hippies' experience from smoking things you're not supposed to smoke on a beach in Hawaii. Right? Your opiate high would you would be up there in the clouds all the time. Much better even than coca. So, the other side of it is, if you were spending half your day engaged in this activity, this would be a huge time commitment. We don't have that time. The only people that could afford to spend so much time doing this silly social stuff is people who don't have proper jobs. Okay, who are they? Well, students and their professors, yeah. Everybody else has to go out there and dig in the soil to grow things, or sit in an office, sort of buying and selling, or what have you. It's only us have this privileged existence. So this really is a non-starter. So the argument is that this bonding gap that we need to fulfill in some sense is filled by language. That's the function. This is my original idea, as it were. The function of language was designed to shift us from grooming into a bigger scale, if you like, by having grooming at a distance through the use of language. And that would allow us to bond these much bigger groups. And language has lots of advantages that grooming itself doesn't, and grooming still doesn't with us. Grooming with us is exactly as in monkeys. It's a very personal, intimate thing. If you go with your girlfriend and your girlfriend's girlfriend, best friend, let's say to a dance, and you spend too much time cuddling with your girlfriend's girlfriend, I don't think your girlfriend is very happy at the end of the evening, right? There's something about this kind of intimacy created by physical contact which really speaks to very close, intimate relationships. And the advantage of, and so it then is very much a one-on-one thing. You do it with one person at a time. What language does is allow us to groom, if you like, with several people together. It also allows us to exchange information about the state of a network. Monkeys can't do that. Their only knowledge of the network is what they see happening in front of their eyes. If their friend defaults on their friendship later on, a monkey would not know that that had happened if he hadn't seen it. But we can find out because somebody in the network can come and tell you that your friend has just betrayed you, or that something is going on, that two other people have formed a new relationship, and so on. So that's one key advantage. A second key advantage is we can multitask. You can't groom and walk and talk at the same time, for example, but you can, you can't groom and walk and feed at the same time, You can only do one of those, but we can talk and walk and feed at the same time. We do it all the time. When we're eating, we can use it to label group members by identifying group members as part of our community because they share the same knowledge of us. They like the same hobbies, they like the same sports, they belong to the same religion or the same political party or whatever it is. These are all mechanisms for managing who's in our group and who isn't. We can, even in primates, is correlated with group size. So these are two nice studies that have been done relatively recently. This one is by Karen McComb and Stuart Semple, in which they looked at the vocal repertoire size of monkeys and apes. So these are apes and these are monkeys, as a function of their social group size, and so showed that there's a nice correlation between the two. Species that live in very large groups have many more calls, vocal calls, than species that live in small groups. In other words, their vocal repertoire is more complex. This is a very recent study, it's only just been published, looking at an index of facial mobility, so the muscular mobility that primates have in their faces, because a lot of our communication, obviously, is through facial gestures, smiling, and expressions of emotion, and so on. So he looked at a measure of how movable the face was, the muscles of the face, to allow more gestures, and then plotted this against group size. And again, you can see species that have live in very large groups, have very mobile faces, can produce more gestures from their faces than species that live in very small groups. And here's another study, a very nice demonstration on birds of the same effect. This is an experimental study, so it's even stronger, if you like. What Todd Freeberg did was, he was working for his PhD, he was working on these black-capped chickadees from the United States, very common woodland birds up in the United States, the woodland bird up in the United States. Don't know if they come this far south. But he looked at the complexity of their vocal calls, their vocalizations, as a function of the size of the group. And he did this first in the wild and showed that groups or populations that had relatively large social groups, this is not, these birds don't form very big flocks, but those that were living in small groups had much less complex vocalizations. Their calls were less complicated than those that lived in big groups here. And then he took some of these birds from the wild into captivity, and he put them in cages of different numbers of birds, either 2 birds together, 4 birds together, or 6 birds together. And these are all from these wild populations mixed up together. So some of them came from small populations of small groups, some from populations of big groups. And then he did the same thing and showed that in captivity, how complex the calls were depended on group size. So in a cage of 6 birds, the birds were giving much more complicated calls than in cages with just 2 birds, even though they might have be a mixture of these wild populations. So the birds are responding to their circumstance. It's not genetically inherited. They're just responding to their circumstance. So vocal complexity is increasing to cope with the complications of living in bigger groups, even on this very small scale. Very nice demonstration. So we, some years ago, in the context of this, then wondered, if language has a social function, is it true that actually we spend most of our time in conversations with each other talking about social things? So we did a study. This is a composite analysis of 3 separate studies, 2 done in the wild, as it were, just people walking around the streets, and 1 done in captivity. That was the student cafeteria at University College London. So this is just the average for all 3. What we found was that, and we just listened to what people were talking about, and every 30 seconds we kind of went, what's the subject of the conversation right now in these categories, where they're talking about social things, arrangements for a party in the evening, or who's going out with who now, or who's been horrid to me today. Were they talking about work? Today's very complicated lecture on Kant's theory of the unthinkable. Were they talking about politics, culture, or leisure activities, sports, which football team is winning this week, and so on. So you will observe, this is very typical of our undergraduate population in Britain. I'm sure it doesn't happen in this university, because you're going to university and going to learn all this important stuff. And what do you discuss? Who's going out with who? And important things like politics and culture, great novels by important Peruvian novelists, I'm sure will be discussed endlessly here. In Britain, this is why we are failing economic state now. But you'll notice the difference between men and women is very small. It's not really significant. There's a slight sense that maybe women spend more time talking about social stuff. The only big effect is men seem to talk a lot about work. And I'll show you why that's important in a minute, but I just want to show you first that this is quite typical, not just of modern post-industrial societies, but also traditional societies. These are data from Kung San, Bushmen. Here they are sitting around the fire. It's what they talked about around the fire. These data come from Polly Wiesner, an American anthropologist who studied these people in southern Africa. And I just draw your attention really to the difference here. We've separated her conversations between daytime conversations and nighttime conversations. You can see in the daytime, they're talking about economic matters, conflicts between the groups, criticisms of each other for behaving badly and so on. But in the evening, they're doing much more joking and telling stories. And I think this is critical for social bonding. This is not. It's absolutely essential to engage in these kind of storytelling activities for social bonding of communities, because they're about your history, why the community belongs together, their common history, their common shared beliefs, and all these kind of things. And that's represented in the stories that a society tells around the campfire and tells their children. These are another study of conversations around a water cooler in Australian offices. So these are Australian data. And I just show you again what they call storytelling. A lot of that's gossip rather than stories in this sense. Very, very high proportion here. This is gossip. By this, they mean negative gossip. So again, social things seem to be very important to our world. But here's the important thing, and it's very important for the girls to appreciate this, because you need to know. Just look what happens when... And these are data from undergraduates, right? Look what happens in conversations in the cafeteria when girls and boys are together or alone. So here are the girls. This is the proportion of time spent talking about work, about today's lecture on Kant's theory of the unthinkable. Very complex. And remember, when you go to university, it is to learn all these complicated things. So it's important you spend time discussing it. Now, it doesn't matter for the girls whether they're in a single-sex group, so they're just talking to girls, or whether they're in a mixed-sex group, there are girls and boys together. They spend the same amount of time talking about today's lectures. But look what happens to the guys. When there's only guys present, they're not really interested in today's lecture. But as soon as there are girls present, suddenly they're world authorities on the lecture. And this is a very common observation, that if there's a technical problem, right, you watch next time in a lecture, the projector doesn't work, or the computer doesn't work. And the girls, maybe as a lady lecturer, she's trying to fix it. Within 30 seconds, there's a big group of men explaining what's going on, trying to figure it out. Not successfully, and they're not being generous Latin Americans, polite and helpful to damsels in distress. What this is about is mate advertising. Right? They're like peacocks, behaving like peacocks. Suddenly some girls come into view and they're showing their feathers. And, you know, what's the best way to show your feathers and how good you are, therefore? It's back to Jeff Miller's story, the Scheherazade effect. And he called it, I should have said, the Scheherazade effect after the heroine of the Arabian Nights' tales, the 1001 Nights. Because remember, Scheherazade avoided being executed by telling her stories by the king, by telling her stories so skillfully that at the end of every night, the story, remember, is that the king had some young girl come and tell him stories, and if he was bored by them, he executed her the next morning. So after many thousands of girls had been executed, Scheherazade came along and kept the king interested for 1001 nights, because at the end of the evening, she left the story hanging, and he couldn't wait to find out what happened next. So he kept her alive, and this happened day after day after day. So this capacity to keep entertaining your mate and keep them interested. This is what the Scheherazade effect was all about. So here's the advertising part of that. Males exploiting whatever cultural opportunities there are for showing how clever they are to the girls. And in the university context, you're supposed to be very clever and very smart, so you understand Kant's theory of the unthinkable and can explain it to everybody. If it's the bridge club, it'll be bridge moves. If it's the Music Appreciation Society, it will be Mozart, K numbers, and how the cataloguing of Mozart's music was arranged. If it's sports, it will be knowledge of sports, famous football stars, or whatever it is. So in each context, each subculture, there is something that allows you to be boastful, if you like. And this is what's essentially going on here. Okay. The other side of it, though, that I mentioned is the policing effect, that may be the opportunity to tell everybody else that somebody behaves very badly, would prevent free riders escaping in the system and destroying the social contract. This is the results of a model that Daniel Nettle, who was once, he did this when he was a PhD student of mine many years ago at UCL in London. Again, on the Enquist and Limar computer model base. So this is a computer population with individuals who have to cooperate by exchanging resources in order to reproduce successfully. Again, you release free riders into it. You start off with 100% cooperators. You put a very small number of free riders into the population who don't pay the costs. And here, in this model, what we were actually using was dialects as a model of free rider control. So the interesting thing about dialects is that they happen all the time. If you think about what language is supposed to be for, it's supposed to be for exchanging information about the world, factual information about the world, information on how to do things, how to make things. And yet, what do we do with this incredibly useful phenomenon? But as quickly as we can, we make local dialects. Language has this extraordinary capacity to produce dialects, which are very, very localized. It's said in England until at least the 1970s that you could identify where somebody was born to within 30 kilometers of where they were born by their accent, by their dialect. Because English was so structured in so many small dialects, all very, very small areas that spoke very similarly and quite differently to the area next door. So in Liverpool, for example, home of the Beatles and all this kind of thing, and an obscure football team that sometimes win things. It's a small city, a very small city, only about 500,000 people, 500,000 people. It's tiny compared to Lima, for example. It has two completely separate dialects, North Liverpool and South Liverpool. And people can tell from Liverpool where you come from by your dialect. And you don't speak, if you're from South Liverpool, you don't speak to people from North Liverpool. And North Liverpool people don't like people from South Liverpool. So these are very strong effects, and it's always puzzled me that despite all this interest in why language evolved for communication, nobody ever comments on the fact that language produces this dialectical effect so easily, all the time. New languages are being created all the time. So English, which now has 6 official languages of English. There's English, which we occasionally lend to the Americans and the USA. There is Scots, that the people in the southern part of Scotland speak, which is sufficiently different from English and American English, English and American English to be considered a separate language. There's different words, different ways of constructing grammar and so on. There's urban black vernacular, the form of English spoken mainly by black American communities in the big cities. Caribbean English, again, different grammatical constructions, different words being used. Senegalese Creole from West Africa, and Papua New Guinea Pidgin English. All derivative of English. And remember, English has only existed as a language for less than 1,000 years. Right? It happens very, very quickly. Already, these are so different, the linguists consider them to be separate languages. In the same way that from Latin, we have Spanish, Occitan, French, Basque is a completely different language. What's it? Catalan, Portuguese, Italian, and French, and Romanian. They're all descended from Latin, all have developed as completely separate languages in really less than 1,500 years, 1,500 years since the collapse of the Roman Empire. So languages diversify very, very quickly indeed, and even by generations. So if you go to Liverpool now, the language spoken by the kids on the street is not the same language and the same dialect and quite the same accent as the language spoken by the Beatles in the 1960s when they were kids on the street. It is noticeably different for those of us who are old enough to have heard the original. All right, so this is a very odd thing. Now, what we were able to show is that if you have dialects in this system, and we modeled dialects here simply as barcodes. Now the supermarket barcode, just a series of numbers, that was how we defined dialect. Each person had a separate number on his forehead, if you like, in the computer world. And you went around, you looked for people who had a similar barcode to you, and you exchanged with them on the grounds that what defines dialects is 2 interesting things. One is you learn them very young, and they become fixed very quickly. Right? It's very difficult for people to change their dialect and their accent after about their teenage years, after about 15. You see this all the time when British people go to America and become academics there. They develop a form of dialect which is called mid-Atlantic, because it's a bad attempt by English speakers to speak like Americans, so that they don't stand out too much as being foreign, right? But it's not really perfect, because they didn't grow up there. They're doing it as adults, so it's a very imperfect sort of imitation, and that's very critical to dialects. It's very difficult to learn them. Only good actors can learn to imitate other people's ways of speaking. So what's important about that is it identifies the community you were born into. So it's a perfect mechanism for identifying kin, extended kin, and members of the community who will have commitments to each other and will be willing to support each other. And the other thing that's important about them is, of course, dialects change very rapidly, which means it's very difficult for somebody to learn a dialect and then still be in the system forever afterwards. In other words, you come in, you try and learn the dialect as it is now, but actually that's the wrong dialect for your age group, right? Because you weren't there when dialects are normally learned. People can realize very quickly you don't belong to this community. And what this model is exactly the same as the Limar and Enquist model. Free riders come in who take the benefits and try to cheat on the dialect formation. And what this shows here is that if you have no dialect, or dialects change very, very slowly indeed, say less than 10% per generation, free riders take over very quickly and wipe out cooperators out of the system altogether. It takes less than 20 generations for the social contract to be completely destroyed, and people become completely selfish because they worry about being exploited. But if you have high dialect change over time, even 30% of dialect change in this model allows you to reduce free riding almost to nothing. Right? And if it's very high indeed, 50% of the dialect changes per generation, then you can keep free riders under very tight control. They simply cannot escape. It's too difficult for them to learn. And this was also the case in the Enquist and Limar model. Here's their bit, part of the world, as it were, where free riders are not successful. Here's the part where free riders were successful. But if you introduce what they call gossip, which is the opportunity for individuals to tell everybody else about the behavior of free riders, then it hugely reduces the area that free riders can be successful in. This is now just this part here, that free riders are successful. So now all this area, you can keep free riders out and make it much easier for the community and the contract to keep going. So the question is, what do we talk about? How does it bear onto these various possible mechanisms? We did a study in the university cafeteria, again the same thing, listening to people's conversations. Every 30 seconds, what are they talking about? And we just looked mainly at the social components and divided the social components into your experiences, other people's experiences, your emotional feelings about something that's happened, comments about other people who are not there at the time, criticism of other people, or advice. You know, I've got this awful boyfriend, what do I do about it? Well, you should do this, and you should do that, and you should do the other. Okay. That's what that is. And if you look at what happens in what people actually talk about, there's no big difference between boys and girls, except that boys give and receive advice and ask for advice more often than girls, which is slightly surprising, but I don't think that's about relationships, is my guess. For the others, they're pretty much balanced. But look at this kind of social stuff, how much more important it is than, say, criticism. This is the policing component. And this advice component is also very low. Most of what we talk about, at least in public, is, you know, who you are, what you like, what kind of person you are, about other people in a similar sort of vein. So this is not criticism of third parties. You know, this is, I met this guy at the last weekend, and he's wonderful, and all these kind of things. It looks like the policing component doesn't really happen. The advice component isn't so important either, although it's possible that because this was done in public, maybe people don't talk about this kind of advice aspect in public. They like to do it in private, where they can't be heard. But even so, it's clear that the policing function itself isn't all that important compared with the pure social exchange function, the gossip function, if you like. And to have a look at this in more detail, we ran a study a couple of years ago trying to look to see whether different kinds of conversation are more memorable. So this is a memory transition study in which we had 4 people, I think, forming a chain. And you tell a story to the first person tells it to the second person tells it to the third person tells it to the fourth person, then you look to see how much is remembered through that chain. By the final person telling the story from the story you started out with. We had little 5-sentence stories, very, very simple. And we had 4 different versions of it. We had one that was purely about the physical world. I think it was about how clouds make rain or something like that, the correlation between clouds and rainfall. And then the other 3 were social. They're the same story. I'll show you what the story looked like. These are 2 versions of it. All right. Actually, let me just go back and explain the 2 versions. So we had one which simply was a factual account of the social events that happened. There was no connotation of gossip or anything like that. One was about the social component of that. So somebody went to somebody and did something, right? This is about social exchange. Somebody went to somebody and did something because they had a relationship with them. And then there was a gossip one in the sense of negative gossip. This is racy and, sort of a moral dilemma kind of thing. So here are the 2 extremes. This is the individual, just factual. One morning, Nancy's alarm clock broke and she overslept, and when she woke up, she realized she was late for an important lecture. She got dressed as quickly as she could, left the house and ran to the lecture theatre. And when she got there, the lecture theatre was empty. Nancy had missed the lecture. Right, just factual statements about what happened. Here's the racy gossip version of this. Nancy is having an affair with her married professor. Recently, she became pregnant. The professor promised Nancy that he would leave his wife, but since Nancy told him she was pregnant, the professor refused to see her, so Nancy goes to the lecture theatre. Nancy told the professor's wife about the affair, I beg your pardon, and the professor's wife was so upset she left the professor. So this is the racy version of the story. It's full of moral what have yous. Exactly the same length, exactly the same number of sentences or propositions involved in each of these stories. How well did they do? The results are beautiful. So here are the 4 people in the experiment. Here are the 4 versions of these stories. Here's the factual, physical story about rain or whatever it was. Here's that individual version about Nancy just oversleeping and missing the lecture. They're remembered poorly. Of course, there's a Chinese whisper problem. The story gets changed. People forget things. So it's remembered less well here than the original. But there are no difference here. But the gossip and social stories, now you inject social meaning into the story, and people remember it much better. But look, there's no difference between the racy, gossipy version and the purely social version. People remember them just as well. So this is our defense, if you like, that it's not the racy, gossip, negative criticism kind of side of language that's important, but just about relationships in general and about, sort of the social world in which we live. And we've just finished another one, although this is just a 1 step. We're just looking at subjects are read, listen to a story being read to them, and then have to write down what the story was and try and recall it as best they can. We're really trying to look at Miller's Scheherazade effect here. So we've got 5 stories altogether. There are a set of social ones which are purely social, about cooperation, all involving the same pair of people. This is just a story about their relationships. This is one of them defecting, betraying the other in some small way. I think the story was about one of them finding the exam paper being left by the Xerox machine by a careless professor. And instead of sharing it with her friend, she kept it secret so that she could answer the questions better in the exam. And then there's a story about romantic relationships. And then we have 2 factual ones. This is about bees making honey, how honey is made. And there's a purely descriptive one, and then there's a very flamboyant one. It's still descriptive, but the language is now very flamboyant and complicated in the way that Miller imagined the Scheherazade effect. And you can see 2 key things. These are women, these are the men. The ecological stories are remembered much, much less well than the social stories, just as we found. The flamboyant poetic language is not remembered any better than purely factual. The girls kind of are a bit more interested than the boys if it's very factual, but it's not a significant difference. And then over here, there really isn't an enormous difference between these various forms of social, although by and large the girls remembered them better than the boys. The only big one is romantic relationships. When it's a story about romantic relationships, girls are tuned in and remember it much better than the boys. So again, it's looking like, by and large, bar this little kind of blip here, the social world is fundamental to how we use language. Now, to try and sort these various hypotheses, remember we've got 4 hypotheses here for how language is used. To try and sort these out, I did what's called a critical tests analysis. Critical tests were invented by Newton, the famous physicist who discovered gravity. And what he said was one of the problems we have is we tend to look for confirmatory evidence for our theories. We have a theory and we go around looking for evidence to confirm that theory from the world. What we very rarely do, and this was Popper's great innovation in philosophy of science in the 1930s, was to try and disprove the theory. Right? Now, what Newton did, without really explicitly defending it, what he tried to do, and in many ways this is exactly what psychologists do in experimental design. Without really realizing this is what they're doing, they kind of develop this as experimental design for hypothesis testing to a very, very high level, but it's unique among the disciplines, I think. What Newton had sort of in effect suggested was you've got your 2 theories, you have to force them into conflict with each other, because very often the 2 theories are designed to explain the same phenomenon in the world. So it's no good going along and saying language is designed to support big groups, and then showing there's a correlation between group size and language complexity, because language is also used in the context of large groups for information exchange. Right? There's a correlation there between information exchange and large groups, which has nothing, in fact, to do with language, but you can't tell, simply by saying there's a correlation between language use and large groups, you can't tell what the causal relationship is. So what you have to do is to go back into the mechanisms, the assumptions that underpin your theories, and look what happens to the outcome when you pitch these assumptions, the underlying assumptions, against each other. And you have to look for cases in which the 2 theories will produce opposite predictions. And then you look for the ones where one theory is supported and the other fails. And that's your critical test. So the form of that has this kind of thing. We have our 4 hypotheses here. We have a series of things, phenomena, that we would expect to be the case that arise from the assumptions, the nature of these hypotheses, and we can specify various predictions that come out. So mates, romantic relationships, will talk more than other kinds of dyads, for example. In other words, people who are making a relationship with each other for romantic purposes will talk more to each other than people who are just having a casual conversation. The instrumental hypothesis says language is not about romantic things, so there's no reason why that should be true, so this prediction should be false. The Scheherazade effect says yes, that should be true because the whole point of language is to entertain your mates or to advertise to your mate, so there should be this difference. Social contracts argument says no, there shouldn't be such a difference because it's not about anything specific to do with the pair bond, the dyad. Social contracts are about the community. And finally, the gossip theory says that shouldn't be true either. Mates and friends should talk equally about these conversations, as it were, should talk equally. So what you have here is a clear case where only one of these 4 hypotheses will predict this particular form of behavior. So you get a matrix like this, and you can add up the number of cases in which your data match this pattern, and also the number of cases in which a critical test applies where only one hypothesis supports that prediction, all the others are against it. So here, where are we? Here, here, here. Those are the critical tests. And then when you add the data in, these are what we actually find from our conversational data. You can see that the match is much better to the gossip theory than to the others. So the instrumental hypothesis is supported by just one general observation And of the 3 critical tests, in no case do the data agree with the prediction. The Scheherazade effect is supported in 5 cases altogether, but neither of the 2 critical tests are supported. The social contracts are supported in 3 cases, but in the 1 critical test is supported. The gossip theory is supported in 9 cases, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. All 9 cases is a perfect match, and all 4 critical tests are supported by the data. So the evidence comes down very strongly in favor of the gossip theory against these other proposals. And so we can eliminate these other theories much more quickly by this kind of method, as it were. Okay, so can we date the origins of language, just to finish up? We might be able to, if we can kind of determine at what point grooming effectively ran out of time. And the critical issue here is we've got lots of cranial volume data from species of fossil humans. We can estimate brain size through time. We can convert that into neocortex ratio and then use that to predict group size for these fossil populations. And then from that, using the equation relating group size to language, to social time in primates, we can predict the amount of social time that each of these fossil populations would have needed as grooming time to support groups of that size. And when you do that, this is what you get. This is the proportion of total daytime spent grooming. Here's that 20% limit you see in primates. Here's what we have in modern humans. The Australopithecines here, just very good apes, they're fine. You get this big jump up to Homo erectus, the appearance of our genus for the first time about 2 million years ago, and then this very fast rise towards the end. And there are 2 kind of big transition points that one can look at. One is around about 2 million years ago, the appearance of Homo erectus. So brain size and therefore grooming time requirements changed very dramatically there. And then here at the end of the Homo erectus period, the appearance of archaic humans leading to Neanderthals and ourselves, again shows this point at which this dramatic rise kicks off. So these are the 2 serious options. Language evolved about 2 million years ago, or maybe language evolved about 500,000 years ago with the appearance of humans, in effect, as opposed to erectus. The way we can test this is to look for anatomical evidence of speech, essentially. And there are 2 bits of data we can use on that. One is the size of the hole at the bottom of the skull through which the nerves go. They go down the spinal cord. And then in modern humans, just up in here, the vertebrae get very big, and the hole is very big. There's a big expansion in neural material to allow nerves to go to control the lungs and the diaphragm, essentially for speech. And what you find is, here, I think this is the right lot. It's a bit faint, I'm afraid. But if you plot the size of this hole, or the size of the space in the vertebra at this level in different species and plotted against their body weight, you get a nice general straight line. But anatomically, modern humans and Neanderthals lie above that line. They have much bigger vertebral passages, if you like, for body weight than other fossil humans in particular. And then the other one is the size of the canal for the hypoglossal nerve, the hypoglossal canal, where the nerve comes out of the bottom of the skull that controls the mouth and the tongue, which again are very important for speech. And if you do that, you find that, as with these data, gorillas have great apes have a relatively small area, size of these canal. The Australopithecines also are rather ape-like. Modern humans have very large ones, and these Neanderthals have hypoglossal canals that are very similar to those of modern humans. The effect of that, this is very sketchy data, but the effect of that is to say You've got thoracic vertebrae, which are primate-like, at least as late as Homo erectus. We don't have any data among Eurasian erectus. These are African erectus. And then once you've got archaic humans, Homo heidelbergensis, about 500,000 years ago, then you get modern human-like ones. Neanderthals are very similar. If you look at the hypoglossal canals, you get the same story. There's only data from this species of Australopithecine. They're very monkey-like. But once you get to anatomically modern humans, Neanderthals, and archaic humans, they're rather human-like, suggesting that the big division is here round about 500,000 years ago and not here about 2 million years ago. So language is late in human evolution. And I'll just finish up to try and illustrate why this is important in cognitive terms that gives us some sense of that. I talked about this, that these intentionality tasks, this ability to understand other people's mind states, it's very important. That leads us to have this capacity at fifth order. Fifth order turns out to be very important for language production. It's what allows us to create sentences which are complex embedded clauses, have complex embedded clauses. So, you know, the house that Jack built that somebody else did something with, those kind of things. And to unpack those, I'm just going to whiz through this, to get to this key thing, that if you ask why we need such complexity, my argument comes down to storytelling. We don't need it in everyday life. We don't use 5 orders of intentionality in everyday life. We probably don't use very often more than 3rd order intentionality. I believe that you think that somebody else supposes something. It's 3rd order. But everybody has this capacity to do 5th order, and it seems very wasteful because it's very complex, very expensive in terms of brain power, as it were. But if you think of it in terms of storytelling, it's obvious why we need it. Just illustrate this with just an example using Shakespeare's play Othello. Right, so remember, Othello is about deception and rivalry and romantic relationships. Othello is led to believe by Iago here that his wife Desdemona, the most beautiful person in the land, is having an affair with Iago, the captain of the guard. And as a result of that, Othello kills Desdemona in his rage. And this was a plot by Iago to try and take over, as it were, political power. And when he kills her, after he kills her, he realizes that actually she was innocent and that it was all a plot by Iago. So it's a great tragedy of deception and romantic relationships and all these kind of things. But if you think what's going on, here's the audience here watching this play, and they have to believe that Iago here intends that Othello supposes that Desdemona is in love with Cassio, the captain of the guard. Now, at this point, I put it to you, you have a basic airport novel. It's racy and it's exciting, but it's not great literature. That what makes the difference between this kind of simple triangular love relationship story, which romantic fiction produces all the time, and great literature, is the fact that Shakespeare, when he wrote it, introduces Cassio as a 4th mind on the stage. So what the audience is having to do is to believe that Iago intends that Othello supposes that Desdemona here is in love with Cassio, and that Cassio is also in love with Desdemona, that they have a real relationship of love for each other, and they believe that each other is in love with the other person. So the audience here is being pushed to their absolute limits. And what's interesting about Shakespeare's plays is that typically his plays have 4 speaking characters on the stage at any one time, each scene. He's pushing the audience to their absolute limit. And in doing that, the limit they can cope with cognitively. In doing that, he's making it really challenging for them and getting them more excited and involved in the story than is possible with a simple story of that kind. But think about what's happening to Shakespeare Shakespeare is having to go one step beyond what everyday people can do. He's having to go to sixth order intentionality. Now, only about 20% of the population can do that, from our data anyway. So this is my argument for why everybody, all of us, can understand and enjoy a good story, but very few people are good writers, because good writers have to be able to go one step beyond the average for the population. They are extraordinary people. They are very much more endowed, as it were, than everyday the rest of us are concerned. Okay, so can we use that then to put a timing around language as such? And the answer is yes. If we look at the size of the visual cortex against the non-visual rest of the neocortex in primates, there's a nice correlation, but it starts to tail off here, and there's a very nice separation between the apes up here and the monkeys. In other words, if you project this line up here, what's happening is the apes and the monkeys, from about here onwards, as brain size is increasing, you have less visual cortex, which is at the back of the brain, than is the case for monkeys in general, among the apes and humans in particular. And one effect that is doing is allowing more and more brain material to be up at the front end of the brain, where we're handling these kind of complexities. And this shows the same effect very clearly. I think here's the sort of deviation from that correlation line, the regression line. Here are the monkeys. Suddenly it starts to take off here. And just look at how much less or how much more kind of frontal cortex humans have compared to monkeys in general. So it seems to me no accident that it is precisely at this point, the appearance of the great apes, you get the beginnings of this kind of theory of mind. Great apes can do second-order theory of mind just about. They're about as good as 4-year-old children when they first grasp this. But it explains perhaps why we humans can do fifth order so much more. We've got all this extra computational power, which is allowing us to model these other minds out there. If you kind of project that back onto the pattern of brain evolution and use that to look at when difference, actually, I probably ought to just explain how we get there. So this is if you plot the data for intentionality competences, here's modern humans, here are great apes, here's monkeys in general, against frontal lobe volume, you get this really extraordinary straight line. And if you use that to estimate intentionality competences of fossil humans, this is the picture you get. Here's the slipped a bit that should be there at 2. Australopithecines being nice great apes like chimpanzees and gorillas. Second order intentionality, it's increasing through the appearance of archaic humans, you get fourth order intentionality, but it's not till you get modern humans that you actually get fifth order intentionality coming in. And what that's suggesting is suddenly with the appearance of modern humans, you get much, much more complex ability to form much more complex language and much more complex kinds of stories than is possible earlier on. So that this kind of evolution of culture, as it were, appears, or the use of language, even though language might appear here for the first time, it's still in rather crude form, and that language as we have it now, requiring fifth order intentionality, probably doesn't occur until the appearance of anatomically modern humans. And I think, just to sum up, language evolved really to meet a social bonding need. It's a relatively recent origin, dating back only about 250,000 years. And the capacity for storytelling made possible by language has played and still plays a very important part in the bonding of communities. It's about your national story, how you come to be here and how you come to belong to the same group, as it were, the same community. But once you've got these capacities in play, humans being very smart, evolution being very good at these kind of things, can then use those mechanisms to do other things. And that's why you get evidence to support both the Scheherazade effect and Deakin's symbolic contracts effect, and indeed the instrumental effect, because once you've got these things in place, like the story of computers, the machinery, the hardware and the software can easily be adapted to these other things. So the evolutionary sequence looks like social bonding comes in first, and then these other things are added in as supplementary evolutionary processes afterwards. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I've probably gone on much too long.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias al profesor Dunbar por esta. He preparado algunas preguntas ¿no? para discutir con el profesor Dunbar, después de lo cual ¿no? habrá intervenciones ¿no? de aquellas personas en el público que quisieran hablar de estos u otros temas de la conferencia que les hayan podido interesar, ¿no? Básicamente, mi interés en estas preguntas ha sido tratar de conectar la propuesta del profesor Dunbar con el trabajo que hemos venido haciendo en el último año en el grupo de mente y lenguaje, ¿no? Voy a leer esto en inglés. ¿Eh? So I will state 4 questions for the discussion in the workshop. In cognitive science, there is an ongoing debate on the evolution of language between Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch 2002 on the one side, and Pinker and Jackendorf 2005 on the other side. The central issue in this debate is following. Both sides agree with Chomsky's claim that language is a unique biological trait of the human species and not a cultural invention. But for Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch, the faculty of language in narrow sense, which includes only the syntactic mechanism of recursion, is not the result of natural selection, but of non-standard evolutive mechanisms like acceptation. This implies that the design of the faculty of language, in narrow sense, has no adaptative functions, like communication. On the other hand, Pinker and Jackendorf claim that the language faculty encompasses other aspects than recursion, which are also inherently linguistic but not recursive, like phonological structure or other syntactic mechanisms, like word order or case marking. They claim further that the design of the faculty of language fulfills indeed an adaptative function, namely the communication of complex propositions in a serial channel, and that language evolved through standard natural selection, that is, it was selected for that goal. My first 2 questions are, first, what is, Professor Dunbar, your position concerning this debate? Do you think that it has any relevance to the question that you state in your paper? Second question, you claim that the main function of language, which explains its evolution, is social bonding. What relationship do you see between this function and language design? I repeat, what relationship do you see between this function of social bonding and the design of language? In other words, to what extent is the design of language faculty an optimal solution to the problem of social bonding? On the other hand, Professor Dunbar distinguishes between an instrumental use of language and a social use of language. And you equate in your conference instrumental and factual. So there would be an instrumental or factual use of language and a social use of language. In the first case, we speak in order to exchange technical information. For instance, to give instructions, to coordinate actions, or to explain the world. In the second case, which we find in spontaneous everyday conversation, we talk about the events of our social world. Professor Dunbar believes that linguistic and psychological theories stress the instrumental or factual use of language. He calls them thereafter instrumental theories. For these theories, language is used to convey information. In consequence, they are concerned in the first place with the role of grammar. My objection is, or my question is, is there really such a clear division between sentences which refer to the social world and sentences which refer to the non-social, to the factual or natural world? Do not sentences which refer to the social world convey information? And for that, I have asked Professor Dunbar to put this diapositive. You see a little text here. No? So it's an example of gossip. No? So then Sheila says to Betty that Arnold told her what Harry was up to, but Betty told me she already heard it from Blanche, don't you know? Yeah. What I want to say is there are also propositions, no? with predicates and arguments, no? Although they refer to events in the social world. No? For contemporary semantics, a central trait of language is what they call aboutness, what semantics call aboutness, the fact that language is always about something. This something can be an event in the factual, natural world, say the rockfall blocked the road, but it can be also an event in the social world. Say, John doesn't believe that Mary loves Peter. In both cases, we talk about an event, and in both cases, a proposition is coded and conveyed linguistically. Our third question is also, don't you think that sentences always convey propositions, both when we talk about the social world and when we talk about the factual world? It could be possible, to connect Dunbar's proposal with Pinker and Jackendorf's explanation of the evolution of language. On the one hand, Dunbar claims that the main function of language is talking about the social world we live in. For him, language is a very powerful mechanism of social bonding. For Professor Dunbar, it is this function which is responsible for the evolution of language. On the other hand, Pinker and Jackendorf claim that the main function of language is the communication of complex propositions in a serial channel. For them, it is this function which is responsible for the evolution of language. Connecting both positions, we could claim that language evolved indeed in the first place for the communication of complex propositions, but of propositions of a very special kind, namely propositions which describe events in our social world. It will be the complexity of our social world, and in particular, the existence of higher orders of intentionality, which made such a complex and sophisticated communication system necessary. Recursion itself, which is a fundamental aspect of language design, would have been selected precisely because it is a mechanism which allows the codification of orders of intentionality which are higher than 2. However, this claim faces following objection. If primates can handle a second-order intentionality, why do they not have just a more rudimentary language than ours, one in which they can say sentences like, I think that John wants P, but in which they can't say sentences like, Mary thinks that I believe that John wants P? As a matter of fact, this doesn't happen. Primates just do not have a language at all. Our fourth question and last question is then, what do you think of this possibility of connecting your theory with the proposal of Pinker and Jackendorf?
Okay, thank you very much for those comments. I'll just very briefly respond to each of them and then open the floor for questions, because by giving a long lecture to you, I've cut short your questions time. That was a Machiavellian ploy on my part to avoid having too many difficult questions from you. You understand? Okay. So very quickly, each of the questions. The first question is, how do I stand on the kind of Hauser, Chomsky, Fitch versus Pinker and Jackendorf position? And the answer is, very simply, I think that, like everybody else, most of this debate is hinged on, if you like, the grammatical structure of language, the capacity for language, and not asked about what languages look for. There's a very, very important principle, and in the context of that, what everybody talks about, almost without exception, and as I mentioned before in the talk, they talk about the evolution of language as a capacity, and they never talk about the evolution of languages, how we get dialects first and then full-blown languages. So, why is English and Spanish different? Not so different, but why is it different? And why are both completely different to, let's say, Chinese or Basque? Basque, not being an Indo-European language, is structurally and in every way completely different, obviously, as you'll know from Spanish, but also from all other Indo-European languages. The whole group of languages spoken from Western Europe right the way through to Bengal in eastern India. So what, people don't seem to ask why those differences occur, why they should occur. And that's really the question I'm addressing. But it goes back to a very fundamental issue in evolutionary biology, or principle, that's known as Tinbergen's four whys. Question why, W-H-Y. And Tinbergen pointed out in about 1960 that when biologists ask the question, why is something the case, they can be asking four very different kinds of questions. And we might think of these as what, why, how, and when. So they might be asking what mechanisms are involved in producing this effect, say language, what machinery allows us to produce language. They might be asking, why do we produce language? What function is it serving? And for biologists, that function is always related to fitness, ultimately. They might be asking, how is it that you get from a fertilized egg, which clearly doesn't have language, to an adult human that has language? What are the ontogenetic processes, if you like, the how component do you get from a baby that can't even babble to an adult? Is it a genetic thing, or is it learnt? Is it socialization? Those kind of developmental or ontogenetic questions. And finally, they cannot be asking when questions. How is it you came to go from a species, an ancestor species, which didn't have language, let's say great apes or Australopithecines, to the species you have now, which does have language? And each of these four are correct questions to ask. Each requires an answer. But these are biologically and logically separate from each other, and your answer to one doesn't commit you to a particular kind of answer on any of the others. So they can be answered separately and independently. And this is why it's perfectly possible for people like Chomsky and so on to discuss the evolution of language and ignore all the other questions, if you like. They're focused on the what questions, kind of mechanistic questions, as much as anything. And one can see subdivisions. Interestingly enough, the first person to point this out, since there are many philosophers here, the first person to point this distinction out was Aristotle, 350 BC, in his Anima works, his books on biology. And he pointed out the first three. He said that these are logically distinct questions. At that time, they didn't understand evolution, so he didn't have the phylogeny question, the when question involved. But aside from that, this is a tradition that's kind of been lost, I think, of understanding, philosophical understanding, that's been lost in many of the sciences, where they focus typically, what happens is most of the disciplines focused on one question, one of Tim Bergen's four whys, and forget about the others. Biology is kind of unusual in that it tries to bring all four together. So that's sort of the issue, really, I think, with question one. Question two, to what extent is the design of language an optimal solution to problems of social bonding? The answer is the design of language really is about information exchange. That's the critical thing. And that has to do with comprehensibility, with the ability to transmit information, and so on. Added to that, though, I would just add that there are aspects of language which are clearly designed to deal with community bonding or the social side, and that is the sort of dialectical issue, the way the words are used, the intonations that are given, the pronunciations and so on, that allow you to identify a community as a group of people who have a shared kind of worldview or a shared language. So the answer is yes and no, I think, to that question. On the one hand, the design of language per se, thinking of grammar, isn't specifically designed to deal with social issues. It's designed for information exchange, because information exchange is the critical thing that allows you to bond in that way. But there are other aspects of language, and usually aspects of language which, by and large, linguists, other than the social linguists perhaps, tend not, the grammarians, let's say, tend not to, formal linguists tend not to be interested in, that are important for social bonding, and I think can only be explained in terms of social bonding, really. Although they may be an accident, it's perfectly possible. There's been a lot of interest in biology in the last 5 or 10 years in cultural evolutionary process. And cultural evolutionary process is normally seen in terms of neutral, non-adaptive evolution. So it's just random genetic drift which leads to differentiation, let's say in this case of two languages. It has no purpose. It just goes that way because of small changes, small mutations in effect, although in this case they're cultural mutations, not genetic mutations, that cause a language to drift apart when the speakers don't meet very often. And that's a perfectly plausible proposition. My argument, I think, on that would simply be that the social bonding mechanism reinforces that and exploits it in the way that the sexual selection argument argues similarly, in order to drive that process faster, because it has an adaptive advantage in community recognition. Okay, question 3, don't you think that sentences always convey propositions? And the answer is yes, that's precisely the point. I think what happens is that the instrumental uses of language have parasitized social uses of language, because that propositional and therefore grammatical structure allows you to convey information, but in itself the grammatical structure, the propositional structure, doesn't specify what kind of information you have to convey, or it should convey. It just allows any kind, and therefore once you have it in place for social reasons, you can use it for all these other reasons too. And in just the same way, the social, if you like, to pursue that analogy a bit further, social use of language has parasitized what you might think of as the language of thought, the internal mental processes that we use for thinking about the world out there before we even speak, that all animals probably use, and which also seem to be structured in propositional form, in causal forms, causal events that happen in the world, and we seem to naturally construct those in terms of causal propositions. Because it makes it easier, perhaps, to think through them, to remember them, and to have a story about why two events are related, rather than just... So it's harder to remember a correlation in the world. X happens, and then A happens, and then B happens. It's harder to remember just that fact than if you say B happened because X happened, and the reason is some connection between the two. That gives you a structure which perhaps makes it easier to test. So I think that each of these steps is sort of parasitizing existing abilities. And lastly, the Pinker and Jackendorf issue, I think I come back down to saying that Pinker and Jackendorf are still primarily interested in how information is transmitted, without particularly being interested in what kind of information. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And I don't disagree with them at all, any more than I really disagree with Chomsky and the Hauser and people, perhaps. But my interest has been in exactly what kinds of information is passed on, rather than how that information is passed on. There are certainly very good questions you could ask about efficiency of language for passing on information. Now, it may well be, if you look at the structure of grammars very carefully, you find that some of the structures of grammar are better designed to handle social world phenomena than to handle factual world phenomena, or the other way around, I don't know. That would be another test. But I don't think anybody, well, the linguists may know better. I'm not aware of anybody that's really looked at the structure of languages in those terms. All I'm aware of is the work that people have done looking at how either the structure of, perhaps the structure of grammar, but also in particularly the structure of the vowel sounds is driven by the need for speech comprehension. So you can only have certain numbers of vowels, and they have to be in certain positions to each other within the speech state space, as it were. Otherwise, they become too confusing for you to differentiate between them. And that, if you like, is asking that kind of question, but it's specifically about the understanding of speech, the comprehension of speech. It's about the mechanism still, but it's showing that there are strong selection, seems to show that there are strong selection pressures for only certain limited kinds of numbers and positions of vowel sounds. You might expect the same to happen with grammar, so different forms of grammar that you can have. Some are clearly much more common than others. So word order grammars like we have in English and I guess Spanish are very different to Latin, which doesn't have a word order grammar, but which has a word ending grammar. Now, I might remind you that English used to have a word ending grammar before these wretched Scandinavians ruined the language for us. Because what happened in the history of English, English was a Germanic language, so it had, like German, a word ending grammar. And it didn't matter whether you said, whatever the Anglo-Saxon equivalent is, king kissed queen or queen kissed king, the word order, because you would know from the ending of each word which was the subject, who did the kissing and who was kissed. But when these Viking Scandinavians turned up in England, Norse was sufficiently different, although it's a Germanic language, sufficiently different that the grammar, word-ending grammars were now very different. And so they ended up creating a kind of Creole and a patois in which they dropped all the grammar initially and just used, the infinitive for verbs and these kind of things, as you do when you go to a new country. And out of that grew modern English grammar. And the only bit of original German grammar that we retained was the bit was still common to Norse, Scandinavian Norse in the 10th century AD and Anglo-Saxon, and that's the possessive case. That's why the only bit of ending grammar is when we say the University of Lima, we can say Lima's University or the University of Lima. It doesn't matter either way, because that's shared with all the Scandinavian languages. In Swedish, it would be Lima's Universitet, exactly the same as in English. We just put an apostrophe in. So that's a sort of kind of historical accident, as it were. But it's kind of indicative of the fact that it's information exchange in a general sense, which is determining language structures here, because these guys were needing to talk to each other, because by and large, although the Vikings did a lot of raping and pillaging when it suited them, they were also colonists looking for new land, basically. And so they needed to trade with the Anglo-Saxons and other peoples in Europe. And so they needed to be able to have common languages. So at the end of the day, the grammatical structure is a reflection of the fact that they just needed to talk to each other and understand what each other were doing. So those are my answers to your 4 questions.
Thanks you very much for your interesting and sound answers. They have been very helpful to better grasp your proposal. Tenemos unos 15 minutos para preguntas del público. Por favor, a ver si pueden. Luis Manuel, ¿tienes acá adelante? Si se pueden hacer las preguntas directamente en inglés, por favor.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I am very interested in this conference, but I find something missing in this hypothesis or these theories. Is we are assuming here that language appears only when we speak, and what happens with our minds? I mean, language for me exists all the time since I wake up. I don't need to speak in order to find myself within language. So what about things like meaning, like narrative, like fiction, like purposes? I mean, things that are possible because language do exist. So it's not only about interacting, it's also about creating my theories of the world. And this is possible precisely because of grammar. Grammar makes it possible to create alternative worlds or perspectives in my life, goals, purposes, or ideas about ethical values. So where do we place that kind of creation of? Where do we place that in this kind of theory?
Okay, I mean, I think the issue is simply one of order of the sequence of history, if you like, in the sense of evolution. I don't doubt that language is used for all these purposes, and this goes back to the Newton's critical tests argument. The problem is, you know, you can have any number of theories of language evolution, and if language does that for you, it organizes your thoughts. You know, the kind of relativist view of how our mental states come about is because language sort of structures the world for us and so on. You know, there are any number of these theories, and you can always point to evidence to support it. For me, from a biological perspective, where we're quite often used to these kind of very complex biological systems, all that's telling me is that that's one of the functions that language is subserved or has come to subserve, but it doesn't tell you which one is the driver for the original evolution of language. And it goes back to the question of being able to unpack, if you like, minor and major causes of evolution and the sequence of history of evolution. And so my position really is, I guess, there are a number of possible alternative histories. One of which, the simplest, says language evolved for social reasons, and then its structure allowed humans to evolve it for these factual kind of reasons, information exchange, purely factual information exchange, not about social world information exchange. And indeed, you might add the formation of literature and you know, philosophy and all sorts of other activities as a third step. Or it could have been the other way around. You know, it could have started, language could have started by the need to philosophize about the world, and then allowed you to have instructions about how to make tools, and then eventually the social world. So these are 2 alternative hypotheses, and in principle we can pitch them against each other, and if we do a critical test analysis well enough, we can maybe differentiate between them, because that order, the specific causal sequence, will depend on specific mechanisms being involved at different stages, and we may be able to point to those mechanisms in history, may be able to show archaeological evidence for that transition. Unfortunately, and it's very unfortunate, only one species has true language in this sense. If we had more species that had forms of language, we could actually do this now through comparative analyses. In biology, evolutionary biology, comparative analysis become extremely sophisticated in their ability to look at the evolutionary sequence and test between alternative evolutionary sequences using very, very sophisticated statistics which have been developed in the last decade, really, no more than that. And this is kind of very exciting. It's all come off the back of, in a way, analyzing the genetic evolutionary data. But it's being applied to other components. So my colleagues have just finished a very nice analysis, for example, showing that monogamy, pair-bonded monogamy in primates is a demographically and cognitive sync state. If you go from any social system into monogamy, you cannot escape it again, and it's a dead end. Because you have to change the cognition so much. I kind of, not specifically about that, but I'll talk a bit more about that kind of thing this afternoon, maybe. But I'm kind of open to, I guess my position is, I don't necessarily have a view that says this is right. All I'm doing is putting the challenge on the table to everybody else to say there are other possible ways, other possible histories you could imagine. And therefore the question for all of us is how to test between them. And if you want to go with a particular view of history, evolutionary history, a certain order, as it were, then my challenge to you is simply, okay, try and prove it. I'm meanwhile trying to prove my alternative version. I like being the minority position against the majority because it's always more fun. You get more abuse. And that's good. In science, that's very good, right? Because the more people challenge you, the more it makes you go back. This is back to Popper, right? Revolutions and what was the title of his book? Gosh, can't think of it. Popper. Sorry? No, it wasn't that one I was thinking of. It's the one where he says basically, when you test a hypothesis, this is the way to test a hypothesis. The most sure way of doing it is to try to prove the reverse hypothesis, right? But the most useful situations in science is when your hypothesis turns out to be wrong. Because in that context, you have two questions you can ask yourself. Is it my test that's not a good test? It's not a well-designed test. I'd better do better. I've missed something out. There's a confound in my design, conflated different components of it. I need to do a stronger test. Or is it the theory that's really wrong? And one shouldn't be naive and assume always that it's the theory that's wrong. You should be forced back to your assumptions about how you've constructed the theory to see what you've left out. And that's always, in the sciences, that's always the secret to success, is finding out that your pet theory is wrong. So the best way to do that is to have a theory which nobody else believes, because they will give you lots of reasons why you're wrong, and that makes you think more carefully about your idea, and that makes you put your idea into conflict with the opposing idea, and to try and find better tests, to try and understand the assumptions that differ, that make the two hypotheses different, and how you can test between them better. And if you can do that, you'll come out with a stronger test. What has been referred to in philosophy of science as, what's it called? Strong science, right? You can test more securely between competing theories and disprove one completely in favor of the other. It's a kind of Bayesian view of hypothesis testing and statistics, I suppose. And then in the end, we all progress because we actually move towards the true understanding faster and more securely than is often the case if you just try and defend your favorite idea, which is, if you like, what religion consists of. You have a view of the world and you try and defend it against all the evidence. Sorry, Mike.
Hello, good afternoon. I think you've proven that the main current function of language is social bonding, but was it necessarily the first function? I recall the classical example of feathers in birds. Perhaps the first function was warmth, not flying.
Yep.
Because in the chart in the table, you use markers that are about the current use of language, except for one, the first appearance in fossil records. But couldn't it happen that the change from Homo erectus to Homo heidelbergensis was the big jump was late, was a late appearance, and then it was when it became the instrumental part of language? I don't know if I made myself clear.
No, I think this is kind of the root of the problem. I mean, you identify, the really big issue, and it's the same question in a sense that you were worrying about. Is it's actually very hard to test hypotheses when you only have one species that does it, and you have no real differences. I suppose it might be better. We might be better off if it were the case that whatever, there are 6,000 or 7,000 different languages in the world today. If these somehow varied in quality, you had very, very primitive languages and very sophisticated languages. But even that isn't true. All languages appear to be equally sophisticated. So we have no way of testing in the usual way where we might design comparative tests. Darwin's great contribution, really, to hypothesis testing. There's a post-experimental method, the comparative method, where you compare, and there's a lot of my graphs for comparing changes in one behavior against changes in another. So it really is very frustrating and very taxing to try and think of ways to test hypotheses that get around this uniqueness problem. So the easy escape for me is to say, I agree with you, can you do better? It's your problem. I'm in a few years, I will be under the ground, I won't have to worry about this. It's you young folk. It's your challenge now. I'm passing the baton to you. The Olympic torch is coming to Peru to sort out the answer to these questions. But we have to, that's what makes science exciting, because it's not easy to do. If it was easy to do, it wouldn't be worth doing, we would get answers very quickly and simply. So I think that what makes science, in this area, the mind and language particularly interesting, is the fact that it is even more difficult than physics. Well, maybe not quantum physics. Do accept that, but kind of ordinary Newtonian physics is very simple and common sense, and we see it happening in front of us. But we can't do that with the mind. We can't do it with evolution. We can't see language evolving. We can't see the mind. We have to kind of infer it in clever kinds of ways, and that's, I think, our challenge.
I think it's time. We have to finish with a workshop. Although surely there are not a lot of questions. We thank a lot Professor Dunbar. I shift to Spanish. Bueno, vamos a terminar el taller. Realmente ha sido una gran oportunidad de poder escuchar al profesor Dunbar dándonos esta clase, ¿no? Tener aquí en la Universidad Católica a un profesor de la Universidad de Oxford hablándonos de evolución. La evolución del lenguaje en este caso, ¿no? En la tarde tendremos la oportunidad de seguir escuchándolo a partir de las 3 de la tarde, ¿no? Hablando de la evolución de la cognición social. Toca sobre la pena, ¿no? Recordar y subrayar, ¿no? La importancia que tiene para nosotros contar con espacios como este en nuestra universidad, ¿no? Espacios de pensamiento libre y crítico, ¿no? Donde se puede discutir, ¿no? Sobre la teoría de la evolución, por ejemplo, ¿no? Y que tenemos que responsabilizarnos de que eso pueda seguir siendo así, ¿no? Por nosotros y por nuestro país. Agradeciendo de nuevo al Grupo Mente y Lenguaje, a los organizadores y a Estudios Generales Letras, ¿no?, de su decano por, ¿no?, esta oportunidad, y los esperamos para las 3 de la tarde, ¿no? Y muchas gracias al profesor Dunbar por su